Comrades, thank you very much for joining us for this session, the weaponization of racism, which has, of course, played a huge role in the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn over the last 6 years and the left in the Labour Party, where racism, anti-Semitism in particular, has been used to kick many of us out. And it's ongoing, which is perhaps the most horrible thing about it. Jeremy Corbyn himself was suspended for pretty much saying that as well, that there is a problem of anti-Semitism, but it has been, I think he said, weaponized or overstated, yeah, and politicized for political reasons by the enemies of the left, quite rightly. Unfortunately, had he said that 6 years earlier, 5 years earlier, and done anything about it when he still had the chance, and it would have made a difference, we could be in quite a different situation today. Sadly, by continuing to appease and trying to keep the right on board, despite mounting evidence that they had no desire to do so, because this is, after all, a class war in the Labour Party. So still to the bitter end, unfortunately, Corbyn appealed for unity over this issue, which has backfired dramatically and has led us to a situation we're in today. A situation that's going to get worse still before it's going to get better. Some people thought when Corbyn's gone, that'd be the end of it. But of course, there are other interests here at stake as well that Tony, I think, will in particular focus on IHRA, and how that's been used to stifle free speech, not just in the Labour movement, but now throughout society. So I'm very pleased to have two speakers here. Who was going to start? You were going to start, yeah? So Jackie Walker first, thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to have a sort of a broad general comments on the weaponization of race. Because yes, it's part of the neoliberal project, it's part of the project of the right, but it does have much deeper historical roots than that. And I think we should be conscious of that, because if we're conscious of the history of those roots, it tells us much more about how it works, because it was through the weaponization of race that racism itself, European racism, was able to manipulate how people feel, how people think, and how people act. It was through language. So I'm not going to go back, to the Stone Ages, but I am going to talk about the way that it initially enabled the European slave trade to occur. Because before that trade, Black people, people of color, they were seen as exotic, as, say, for example, elephants were, or giraffes were, or certain flowers were, but they were not seen, and this is very important, as intellectually different. They were not seen as non-humans. And we know that, for example, because when people use the example of the Roman slave trade to say, well, in Europe, we just did what the Romans did. Not true. The Romans had a Black emperor. They had soldiers, which included officers, garrisoned in this country, in Hadrian's Wall. And in those times, it were the Britons who were thought to be the savages. And in fact, Rome acknowledged that it got much of its knowledge and culture from some African cultures like Sudan or Nubia. So with the slave trade came the invention of a language of Black oppression. Now, Europeans of the 16th century had to dig very deep to find these words that would weaponize race as a way to see the other. Because, for example, we know that writers, look him up if you like, people like Montaigne did not see people who were the other in this way. In fact, he saw those people as having ideas that Europeans should actually learn from. There was a dramatic shift of response as empire and slavery really got underway. And this language remains embedded deep within the psyche of Europeans and European cultures. And by the way, I include myself in that. As Frantz Fanon would say, that is the language that has gone into my psyche as well. Now we can see this, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for example, the way that peoples of color were divided into different gradients of color and given different names. I think in Haiti, for example, there were 16 gradients of color that a Black person could be, and a specific monetary value was put on them. As resistance from people of African descent started, there were also words that became used to describe African people who were either cooperative or resistant. And there were words that were linked very strongly with Black people in order to engender fear of people of Black descent, fear that all Black men want to rape white women, fear of white desirability, and in the reverse, because of course, if you're Black, you can't win, fear that the Black enslaved woman would in fact win the love of the white master. Now, as people of African descent gradually won their liberation struggles, the language of race also changed, and Black people became involved in the construction of this language, often turning derogatory words to their advantage. Black, for example, was adopted over the term colored, and it was then linked with other words like beautiful and power. Now, I came to this country in 1959, and even though, of course, I was a sort of daughter of the empire, I'm waiting, by the way, for my medal to come on that. I'm expecting my, my daughter of the empire medal anytime now. I had to be taught the language of English racism. I had to be taught to really understand the language which would be turned against me. I mean, for many people here, Enoch Powell is the best known example from that period with his rivers of blood speech, real weaponization of race going on there, that link with blood, the fear that the Black will come and massacre you in your bed. This was not just simply rhetoric. This had an everyday effect in the life of Black people like me. These were the words that we used to terrorize me on the streets where I played and the house where I lived. But race wasn't just weaponized by Tories or even ex-Tories. It was also part of the language of Labour throughout my childhood, and it was brought out as a tool, one way or another, depending what suited the interests of whichever governing faction was in power at the time. More recently, we've seen the weaponization of the left being used, in fact, with the white working class. Now, there's a really important and significant story to tell there, but it's a very complex one. And it is, of course, intrinsic to the rise of parties like UKIP. And even though UKIP is sort of defunct, they have done their job. They have had a lasting effect, not just on the media, but the whole of the dialogue of politics, the whole of the upsurge of the right. But excuse me if at this point, that is not the focus of what I'm going to say. And we can see how some of this fed into the strategies of the right and neoliberals to co-opt the language of liberation, the vocabulary of the left. First, undermining this vocabulary as political correctness, and then appropriating our hard fought for formulations of identity, of history, of oppression in order to enhance their reactionary narratives. Now we see this not just, of course, in terms of the strategy that's used against people of different ethnic groups, but also even against the poor. We see this used. In Britain, the left has been under sustained attack as a consequence of its success at knocking on the doors of power. It is no coincidence that among the tools used to undermine, fracture, and attempt to defeat us is this appropriated language of liberation, in particular, the language of race. Now, of course, all racism, whether Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, is abhorrent. But the palatable nature of critiquing a racism decoupled from notions of power or the lack of it has proved a powerful tool for the establishment to attack the left, and they have run with it. This whitewashed version of racism is one where racists are not Tory ministers who ridicule the appearance of people of African descent. It is not the refugee and the so-called migrant crisis, and it has nothing to do with evidence or the structures of power. This racism has to do with feelings. Conveniently, according to the mainstream media, it's the left who are the culprits in this new racism. And on the left, it's our very commitment to anti-racism that is used to undermine the unity we so badly need in order to resist this particular onslaught, as well as, of course, as an inability to get access to the mainstream media, however much we have tried. Now, it's not a coincidence that the most oppressed minorities have barely registered in this fashionable discussion of race, except at one point, of course, and that was in the eruption of Black Lives Matter, a movement which the forces against us quickly either appropriated or undermined. And that doesn't mean it's gone, but we can see how they packaged it for their consumption. So the people it really excluded was the voices of actual Black people, of Muslims, who, when we put our hands up and said, actually, this is racism, we were told we didn't know what racism was. This new anti-Semitism, with its focus on a faux version of anti-Semitism, has simply had the effect of continuing, and I would suggest increasing, the oppression of oppressed minorities. We inhabit a world where politics increasingly appears like a fraud perpetrated by interest groups, backed by an economic and political elite who control what is said, what you can say, as they disseminate whatever it is they choose in order that they can control what they increasingly have. And I mean, the pinnacle of this was seeing today, as I was on my way, the extraordinary, I mean, I thought it was a farce. I thought it was a farce within a farce. We have the political show that's happening down the road, the pantomime of conference. And in the pantomime, launched this afternoon, in fact, perhaps at this very moment, we have Labour Friends of the Police. Yes, you heard it here. Labour Friends of the Police are being launched. Now, first of all, I thought this was a joke. And I tweeted it, retweeted it, and I said, have they asked Labour Friends of Black people if that's okay? And then I said, oops, I forgot. There isn't a Labour Friends of Black people. And then this white guy came on to Twitter and he said, how dare you talk so condescendingly to Black people? That tells you the trick that has been played. Now, what I say is too long, the left has been on the defensive on this territory. It's time to reclaim anti-racism. And as Conference did yesterday, in its decision to name Israel as an apartheid state, we need to make totally clear that not only do we understand, but we absolutely are confident in knowing what oppression is and what it isn't. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's been quite Orwellian, hasn't it? The lifelong anti-racists are the anti-Semites, are the racists. Our next speaker is Tony Greenstein.
Thank you, comrades. I was just going to pick up on something Jackie said when she said there was 16 degrees of whiteness in blackness rather in Haiti, and it reminds me of a slogan that I remember from my history course, that money whitens, and that was the situation in there. But what I wanted to do was deal more with the weaponization of anti-Semitism, in particular the weaponization of the Holocaust itself. Remember the Holocaust, we have today lots of museums. We have Holocaust memorial days, and Jackie got into trouble for asking why some categories were excluded from the Holocaust. And I looked at the Holocaust Memorial Day website, and it's true. I mean, some Holocausts are called genocides, but there's only one category of people who suffered from the Holocaust, and that is the Jews. And in fact, there was a debate between Sybil Middleton, who was the chief researcher at the US Holocaust Museum, and Yehuda Bar, who's I would say the dean of Zionist Holocaust historians, as to whether other categories of people could be included in the Holocaust. And Yehuda Bar, who's a Zionist historian, and he speaks for other Zionist historians, was quite clear. No, there was only one people, only one group suffered from the Holocaust, and that was the Jews. Not the gypsies, not the disabled, and so on. Why? Because the Nazis launched everything they did, the war, as a war against the Jews. So they take class completely out of what happened. In fact, anyone who knows anything about the Nazis will know that their first victims weren't Jewish, they were the working class, the trade unions. Dachau was specifically set up for what they considered political criminals. They made the trade unions illegal on the 2nd of May, 1933. The reason why there was a focus on the Jews were that Jews were seen as the biological creators of Bolshevism. The Jews were responsible for Judeo-Bolshevism, they called it. So Zionism takes class and takes fascism completely out of it. But I wanted to just have a look at some of the ways, because why has anti-Semitism been so potent in the Labour Party and in Western society? I would argue the reason is because of the Holocaust, because of the way the Holocaust has become part of really Western imperialist ideology. I mean, I quote Yitzhak Laor. He said, he's an Israeli poet and one of their most famous poets, and he said, what's happened is a consolidating a new ideology of exclusion. Now it is the Jews who are the insiders, the genocides and the Jews served in the construction of a European identity. And that is very much true. I mean, it was taken to its most ludicrous limits by a guy called Richard Spencer. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. He's the founder of the alt-right in America, and he's a neo-Nazi in essence. And when Donald Trump celebrated Holocaust Memorial Day without once mentioning the Jews, he said he was glad that the Holocaust had now been de-Judified. But that, in a sense, sums it up.
Yeah.
It is actually the Holocaust is something that could be free of Jews in any real sense. So I want to spend just a few minutes on the way that the Holocaust has been weaponized. I mean, it was Gerhard Riegner, who was representative, I think it was the World Jewish Congress in Geneva during the war, who said of the Holocaust that it is our moral capital and we have to guard it. And that's absolutely true. For Israel, it has been its moral capital, and it has spent it and continues to spend it. But I think what people don't know is that the Holocaust, the use of the Holocaust, is actually quite recent in Western propaganda. After the war, anyone who spoke about the Holocaust was considered a red, a pinko. And in the days of McCarthyism, that wasn't a very good thing. I mean, the song that was sung at the funeral of the Rosenbergs, who were executed as a result of that McCarthyist witch hunt, was the song of the Warsaw Ghetto. And in Israel itself, I mean, I can give you numerous examples where it was virtually disregarded. In fact, the Holocaust victims were seen as a great shame in Israel, because unlike the Zionist pioneers, they'd gone like sheep, literally that is what was said about them, to the gas chambers, unlike the Zionists who had fought against the Arabs and held their head high. And in a 220-page, the first Israeli history textbook issued in 1948, 220 pages, just one page was devoted to the Holocaust, compared to 10 to the history of the Napoleonic Wars. So that gives you some idea of the perspective. And I quote Hansi Brandt, who was the wife of Rudolf Kastner, Joel Brandt, who was one of the leaders of Hungarian Zionism. And she wrote how when she settled on Kibbutz Gvat Haim, the other members talked about their war to avoid hearing about hers. They were ashamed of the Holocaust. And Yisrael Gutman, who's again late Yisrael Gutman, who's one of Israel's Holocaust historians, said that Israelis listened to the survivors' stories with a forced patience that was soon exhausted. In Ben Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel and the longest serving before Netanyahu. The Holocaust survivors were hard, evil, and selfish people, and their experiences destroyed what good qualities they had left. They were a mob in the human dust, without language, without education, and without roots. And as Ian Lustig, another Israeli historian, but not a Zionist, noted, when Israelis talked about the Holocaust, the sentiments they expressed were less likely to be sympathy or sadness for the suffering of the victims, and more likely to be a denigration of their past. So Israel, for the first, 20 years nearly, the Holocaust was barely on the agenda. It was only with the Eichmann trial, if anyone remembers that, in 1960-61, when the Holocaust assumed a new significance in Israel. Before that, when they took children, they didn't take them to Auschwitz, which they do in their thousands today. They took them to Masada, where, if you remember, the Jewish zealots sacrificed them rather than surrender to the Romans. That was the vision of the fighting Israelis. So Gideon Hausner was the prosecutor in the Eichmann trial. The question he asked of those who came to testify, who were survivors of the Holocaust, is, why did you go like sheep to the slaughter? As if unarmed people had any means of resisting SS soldiers with machine machine guns. It was such an absurd question, but nonetheless, that was the question that was asked. And I say today, Israel takes thousands of children, and you may have seen photos. They dress themselves, they cover themselves in Israeli flags. It's a complete nationalist feast, as it were. The moral is that unlike the Jews of the diaspora, who we have contempt for, because Zionism historically had total contempt for the idea of a Jewish diaspora, we will fight. And in so doing, what they've done, and again, I quote Yitzhak Laor, the Arabs, the Palestinians, have in essence been turned into the new Nazis. There's been a transference of guilt, and that came to the fore with Netanyahu at the 2017 World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem, when he actually invented a conversation between the Mufti of Jerusalem, who's the British appointed leader, if you like, of the Palestinians, in fact, the Zionist appointed leader, who's Sir Herbert Samuel, and Hitler. And according to what Netanyahu reconstructed, this was in November, they met in November 1941. Hitler said, I want to expel all the Jews. And the Mufti said, no, you can't do that because they'll only come to Palestine. You've got to burn them. And that was the cause of the Holocaust. The only problem with that is that the Holocaust began 6 months earlier with the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, when special killing squads were sent in the wake of the army to kill, and they did kill over 1 million Jews. And the meeting between Hitler and the Mufti occurred 4 days before the establishment of the first extermination camp, Chelmno, in Poland. So, I mean, there is no historical basis whatsoever. But this is the logical culmination of Israel today. I mean, Israel will supply weapons to the Azov battalion in Ukraine, which is a neo-Nazi militia, without any problems, and to other far-right states throughout the world. And its friends, of course, are people like Bolsonaro, who's come out and said he's a Hitler supporter, lover, just like Duterte of Philippines, and they've got no problem with that. So the Holocaust is completely divorced from any context whatsoever. And it was the way it's been used, I think, was best summed up by Professor Edith Zertel from Tel Aviv University in an excellent book, The Politics of Nationhood. And I really do suggest, if you can get hold of it, you do. When she said, there hasn't been a war involving Israel, quote, that has not been perceived, defined and conceptualized in terms of the Holocaust. And that is absolutely true. So Abba Eban, who was Israel's foreign minister, described the green line between the West Bank and Israel proper, if you like, as the Auschwitz borders. In other words, if we give it up, then we'll suffer a new Holocaust. And I could go through numerous examples of where the Palestinians are compared. I mean, to the Nazis. Menachem Begin spoke about Arafat, quote, Arafat stroke Hitler in his bunker in Beirut, Berlin. This, you remember, the siege of Beirut in 1982. So Arafat was Hitler in his bunker, and the Israelis were therefore carpet bombing Beirut in order to wipe out Hitler. But the best summation of how Israel uses the Holocaust and the lessons it draws, because it doesn't draw the universal lessons that we would draw from the Holocaust, that racism is wrong, that it must never happen again, and so on. What he says, it has the exact opposite effect. Gideon Levy wrote in Haaretz recently, I have yet to hear a single teenager come back from Auschwitz and say that we mustn't abuse others the way we were abused. There has yet to be a school whose pupils came back from Birkenau straight to the Gaza border, saw the barbed wire fence and said never again. The message is always the opposite. Gaza is permitted because of Auschwitz. And that is the Zionist lesson that is to be drawn. Another example is Israel's deportation or attempted deportation of 40,000 black refugees from Africa. Their crime, and it's a double crime. Not only are they not Jewish, they're not even white. So they clearly have no right to stay. So Haaretz journalist Nir Gontars described his reception when he rang up various dignitaries, including the director of Yad Vashem. For those who don't know, Yad Vashem is Israel's Holocaust Propaganda Museum. And I say propaganda museum because it's entertained all sorts of fascists, starting off with John Vorster, the former Prime Minister of South Africa, who'd been interned during the war because he was a supporter of the Nazis. But that was absolutely no problem to Yad Vashem. And Nir Gontos described what happened when he rang up Yad Vashem's personnel and asked them to speak out against what Netanyahu was doing. Because, I mean, after all, one of the conclusions from the Holocaust is that if the Jewish refugees had been allowed into America and Britain and so on, then far fewer would have died. It would seem pretty obvious to us. But he said, one after the other of the senior staff there, including Mr. Avner Shalev, the director, slammed the phone down on me when I asked to speak to them. I asked them this morning to remove from their database the details I gave them in the past about my family. So that is the way that Zionism uses or misuses the Holocaust. If I had time, which I don't, I would go into the way that the Zionists disregarded what was happening during the Holocaust to the extent of denying it was even happening during the Holocaust itself. They made the Holocaust figures in every second speech that they make today about why Israel has the right to exist. But at the time, they didn't want to know because their priority was not what was happening in Europe. It was building their state in Palestine. But I'm going to be bringing out a book which will go into that in much more detail. And I've probably taken up far too much time now. So we shall finish there. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. I think if you haven't read Norman Finkelstein's The Holocaust Industry, that also deals with a lot of the stuff that Tony was talking about today. Okay, Leah, you want to say something? Thanks. Okay, would anybody like to speak from the floor? We've got until about 2:30 if we want to, but we can finish earlier. Anybody? Grab. No? Did you want to come back on each other, perhaps, on any particular issues? I suppose the thing that we kind of avoided speaking about, certainly I did, because the truth is I'm actually sick and tired of talking about anti-Semitism. I think it's a trap that we have fallen into, and I think it's ridiculous. We all know that anti-Semitism is not part of the problem of structural racism that pervades the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe today. We know that Jews are not excluded from power or jobs or housing or education or health or anything else in our society. But what we have to get to, I think, is where we actually do start talking about the way that other racisms have been used and actually reject the parody, the pantomime of what we saw yesterday of Margaret Hodge, etc., being protected by a Praetorian guard to be hailed as these extraordinary survivor victims, that these millionaire privileged people are used in that way. Not, of course, that money always exempts you from being the target of racism, as we see, for example, with Marcus Rashford. And we can see the very different way that that's played in. Somebody who actually keeps himself only and totally towards a very confined and what should be a very unambiguous and uncontroversial agenda of the welfare of children is continually the target of anti-Black racism. But I can see that someone over there wants to make a contribution. So, Deepa.
Thank you. It's always very educative to hear Tony and Jackie speak. So my question to you, Jackie, is firstly, the role that Britain and America are playing today in a kind of new form of imperialism. Could you tell us a little bit about that, particularly in relation to both Islamophobia we see here in Britain and overseas? And I say this knowing that we have just, and I use the word celebrated in a bad way, because we've just commemorated 20 years of people being at Guantanamo, and 780 Muslim men, and it was only Muslim men, have been interred there over time, many of whom have suffered the most horrific torture. So what are the kinds of things we should be talking about when you say, let's not talk about anti-Semitism, let's talk about racism? I would really like to see that change, and I'd like people to talk more about what the Labour Party should be doing in response to the oppressions we see in society. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you. I was going to, Ian wants to speak as well, and I'm going to say something if that's okay. I'm using the chair. Yes, I think we all know in this room that anti-Semitism is not a huge problem in society at all, and it's not a huge, even a big problem in the Labour Party either, but it has been used successfully. We know why. Corbyn was soft on it, and it's stuck. And it's, I think the problem is it's still a fight that we actually have to win in educating people and explaining to them that this is not real. It's been weaponized. It's been used to attack our forces. And I think it's interesting to think about that a little bit more. Why is it not stopped with Corbyn's departure, and why is it not stopping with our defeat? And we've been defeated on a massive scale. I think Momentum CLPD are kidding themselves when they're thinking this conference is 50-50. I think we've been defeated. We have to be quite clear about that. Corbyn tried to appease the right unsuccessfully, when it led to our defeat. The right was, we should have taken on the right. But I think there is a systematic thing going on. I think with capitalism being in dire straits, which is shown, with the defeat, if you want, over Afghanistan, having to withdraw from Afghanistan. Even Joe Biden is admitting that the American century is coming to an end. What's next? Nobody knows. Capitalism is becoming increasingly irrational. You just have to look outside and trying to get petrol. I mean, it's madness. Absolutely. Although actually it took me 5 minutes this morning. So what's going on? But that's another irrationality. You read the papers and you think the world's coming to an end. It's not actually that bad. But there is increasing signs of irrationality of a capitalism in decline. And I think the potential of the left challenging something like that is always there. And the attacks on free speech in academia, which we discussed earlier, the imposition of the IHRA across society, not just in universities, sending children in detention who are shouting free Palestine, things like that, and things like the right to protest. I mean, this is a system that is actually, while we're not quite there, the working class, but the system in itself is very vulnerable, and it knows it. They know it. So the potential of our forces getting it together again is very much in the back of their mind, and that's where I think the anti-Semitism thing. Why is it being still pursued, even though Corbyn has been defeated and the Labour Party is, kind of safe for capitalism again, thanks to Starmer, is something that while I'm kind of bored of it myself, I think we cannot take it too easily, and it's still a fight we have to continue fighting. Ian and then Graham.
Sure. Okay. Well, I agree with Jackie on the question of anti-Semitism being a fraud and a subject you can get weary of discussing, but. Yeah, in the form that it's being discussed, the fraudulent allegations that are being sort of what they call syndicated or whatever through the media and through the whole establishment or whatever. I think that's true, you know. I think the interesting question is what Tina's touched on, is the question of why, you know, and I think that comes on to the question of what exactly what has changed since Tony was talking a lot about the Holocaust, but what has changed since the Holocaust? I think addressing that is a more interesting question, you know, because obviously something has changed in the situation. You know, before the Second World War, Jews were in a similar position in many places to black peoples and other, you know, Muslims or other minorities in advanced capitalist countries today. They were ghettoized. They were subject to systematic racist attacks. They were persecuted. That is not true anymore. And the question of exactly how that came to be and what implications it has today, I think is more interesting than simply discussing the ins and outs of the phony allegations of anti-Semitism that we have to deal with, unfortunately. I think that, you know, the role of what has Zionism done? I think Zionism has, in a reactionary way, emancipated the Jews from racism, from the previous oppression. In a reactionary way, though, it's done it at the expense of another people, you know. And I think that's what we have to be aware of, you know, basically the people who are in the position of the Jews in the previous historical period are the Palestinian Arabs, and they are being treated in a genocidal way. It might not have got to its situation it did at when they took the decision at that conference, 1C or whatever it was, where they actually decided to actually go ahead and exterminate the Jewish population. But nevertheless, Jews are Palestinian Arabs are subjected to similar persecution. I mean, the funny thing is that in the Labour conference yesterday, the resolution that was actually passed talked about the ongoing Nakba, right? The ongoing Nakba that's been going on since the beginning of the original Nakba, which is 1947-48, you know. And that is true. I think that, you know, the Nakba was a massive pogrom, right? A massive expulsion of the Palestinians from their own country. And that's been going on ever since. Sporadically, it goes up and down, and it goes into abeyance for a while, and then it carries on, you know. And you see the pulverization of Gaza, you see the annexation and the terror on the West Bank and whatever, you know, and the things that went on in the Al-Quds conflicts in May, earlier this year anyway, you know, where Palestinians in Israel itself, i.e. so-called Israeli Arabs, became targets of systematic pogroms and racism, you know, in an overt way, but it's always been sort of hidden, you know, and pretended that it was okay. You know, that is an ongoing thing. That is a similar situation to the situation that Jews were put in today. So I think that while there is a certain, you know, there is a certain level of prejudice against Jews, which I think is a you know, it's a residual thing from another era. I think that oppression relationship has been inverted, you know, and I think that's why, you know, Tony himself talks about so-called, I'll finish in a minute, so-called anti-Semitism being the fake anti-racism of the bourgeoisie. I think that's where it comes from. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, I can't remain silent after one of the comments there, which is so fundamentally wrong, in my opinion. Zionism hasn't liberated the Jews. It has helped to imprison them. Let's get this very clear. To paraphrase Marx, a nation, or in this case, a people that oppresses another, cannot itself be free. And that is the first point I really want to make, apart from fundamentally disagreeing with that, is to say that Tina is right. We cannot sweep the issue of anti-Semitism under the carpet as if the issue doesn't exist. I've had this from leaders of the left. Oh, let's not play to the right wing's agenda. We cannot avoid it. We have to challenge it. And we do so in two ways, and it's got to be quite nuanced, in my opinion. One, it's a really good word that Jackie used. It's the white whitewashing of racism. This is the narrative, the agenda of the ruling class and their direct representatives in the Labour Party that create a sort of fake kind of anti-racism, as you say, decoupled from issues of power and obscuring the real racism in society and in the Labour Party towards Black comrades and Asian and Muslim comrades. That's true. But why has it succeeded? All because the ruling class does it. Doesn't mean to say it necessarily will take hold. And I want to talk as someone who's Jewish myself from my own experience, because it may or may not be helpful to people. I was brought up in that post-Holocaust generation. And okay, you're right, Tony, the real narrative of the Holocaust didn't really begin until the late 1950s, early 60s with Eichmann. But my experience was a sort of trauma that was part of a collective trauma. For years, say from the age of 10, 11, for 15 years, well into my adulthood, I had a recurring nightmare. And the nightmare was being surrounded by SS guards, having my trousers taken down, seeing that I was circumcised, and knowing that I was going to be murdered. Now, those dreams, those, I don't care what you want to call it, had no material basis in my current situation. Unlike perhaps Tony, who said that he didn't suffer prejudice, I most certainly suffered prejudice. I was told that Hitler should have finished the job when I was 6. I was told that you Jews killed our Jesus. And when I explained that Jesus was a Jew, I always used to patiently explain, even at the age of 6, I was laughed at. So it entered into my consciousness. And of course, it wasn't just a personal thing. It was part of what some academics, but with some truth, call the collective memory of this. So we have to distinguish between those who cynically manipulate that, say like Margaret Hodge, say like Angela Rayner, and some like Tom Watson, who dares to tell left-wing socialist Jews what anti-Semitism really is. We have to distinguish between that and the fact that they're on fertile ground and they're connecting with a real thing, which is that collective trauma. And that is a very dangerous thing. Why is it so dangerous? Because it actually is really unhealthy for the people who are experiencing it. It others everybody else, it exceptionalizes anti-Semitism rather than connects it, which is the crucial thing that we must do. So to just say, oh, this is just fake, which it is, of course, at one level, because Jews are not in this country. I don't quite agree. What Jackie Zoichi said throughout Europe is not true. In some parts of Europe, Jews do suffer real racism. We have anti-Semites and the head of states in Poland and Hungary, for instance, and that matters. So, but the point is it's on fertile ground. So what do we do? I'll give one example and then I'll stop. I've only experienced anti-Semitism once in the Labour Party, but there was another occasion when Corbyn first became leader, and there was it appeared to be hysteria from some young Jewish comrades who were petrified, literally petrified, what they thought Corbyn meant for them. And my instinct was to put my hands around them and say, comrade, you've got nothing to worry about. This is a nightmare from a previous generations. And so we're both to be empathetic to some of these who are not total frauds and using it for their own political advantage, to empathize with them on the one hand, and to tell the untarnished truth. We talk about racism, who it affects, who are the material, what are the material conditions of the various peoples concerned. And we tell the truth in an empathetic, non-labeling wrong way. And that way we can begin a more nuanced understanding while this ruling class trap, while this Zionist trap, while this Labourist right-wing trap has actually succeeded when so many others have failed. And then perhaps we can begin to address what is a continuing problem. And I'll go further. Unless we begin to address it, I don't think the left can escape, to use the term which is ironic, I don't think the left can escape the ghetto in which it is imprisoned. So this Zionism liberatory, are you having a laugh? Thank you.
Funny enough, I had a similar dream actually, but being German, it's the other way around. You know, the collective guilt that you get taught in Germany is quite traumatizing for a lot of young people as well. I think our two speakers want to reply to a few things.
I want to clarify something. First of all, it was sloppy language. When I was saying Europe, I wasn't talking about this sort of Eastern Europe. I still have got a lag in my head. I kind of, in a way, still think of the sort of old Europe, as in, you know, France, Germany, Italy, etc. And I certainly didn't say that anti-Semitism didn't exist. And I think that's the impression that has been given here. What I said that I, as a Black and Jewish person, had had enough of the focus on it. I didn't say that it didn't exist. So I think that's very important to say. And I also understand the sense of collective trauma, because if you don't think Black people have traumatic dreams of attack and murder and rape, if you don't think that every time that we hear a football mob chanting about us, we don't think about what our chances are if we were to meet that mob, that is trauma. And that is trauma that is the real and the now, that affects me every time I walk out of my house. And Graham, you know that that is true. There is an actual difference between the way I walk around in the streets as an observable Black person and the way you walk around the streets. And that is extremely important. To just say something about the rest, you know, I think, yeah, the system is very fragile. It is on that point of collapse. And I don't want us, because I'm not being dragged away and just focusing on this, I'm thinking as well about Islamophobia, which I think is actually so powerful at the moment. And of course it does link. And I think where the link is with the end of the European empires at the end of the war. Their focus had to go elsewhere. Colonialism was coming to an end. We have only one real colonial state, after all, which is Israel now, as far as I know. And so it has turned into a different axis of antipathy and power. And of course, our arms trade, our whole power structure and the way we motivate people, the way that we motivate people to make decisions against their interests, i.e. to vote for parties that spend billions on war, that spends billions on police, that spends billions on all these repressive methods, is to make people scared of something or make people try and keep something. And you can see this, and this goes on to something somebody else was saying, you know, what is going to happen now after Afghanistan, after that awful shambles, after that shambles of pretense that we actually give a shit about Muslims? Because I think the answer for that is what we see in China and what's happening with the Uyghurs. Because there you have, interestingly, when it suits Euro-America, suddenly Muslims are the victims. Suddenly Muslims are seen as these people who are precious and we have to protect. And that tells us where the next fear is coming from. Because of course, where it's coming from is China. And what we're building up is for a cultural and a military defensive stance, a building up of weaponization against China, giving us the kind of moral clothes, using that protection of Islam. Well, I think Muslims should be protected, of course, in China, but I also think that they should be protected at home.
Yeah, a number of things really. First, I mean, Graham's experiences of anti-Semitism are different from mine, but that may be because Graham's about 5 years older than me, and I think actually. No, it's not all. But I think it's actually true that after the war there was anti-Semitism, but it did dissipate rapidly. I mean, I lived until I was 11 in non-Jewish working class communities, and I honestly say I didn't experience it. But I think, I mean, I take your points as valid. But for me today, racism is not personal prejudice. Racism is what the state does to people. Yeah. Anti-Semitism is prejudice. Someone may make a joke about how I'm stingy or what have you, but that's not. Thank you, Jackie. I'll see you after. But that's not racism. That is personal prejudice, maybe bigotry or what have you. I see Graham finds it highly amusing. It just speaks volumes about this. But, you know, I mean, when I drive, I don't get stopped because I'm driving while Jewish, do I? I'm not being deported to Israel because I'm Jewish. Maybe that will happen. But, you know, if they put me in prison next July, it won't be because I'm Jewish, etc. So, I mean, I don't suffer systematic state racism. And anti-Semitism before the war was actually a form of state racism. I mean, my dad, who was pretty right-wing, he's a rabbi and so on, he never voted Tory because he fought against the fascists. And he understood the fact that the Tories were sympathetic to Mosley and so on, and Hitler, the Anglo-Jewish the Anglo-German Fellowship in Parliament was stuffed with Tory MPs who were sympathetic to Hitler's project. So let's be quite clear about that. I certainly disagree with Ian that Zionism emancipated Jews. Zionism alienates Jews from their surroundings. That's the whole basis of it. It turns them into really almost settler colonials by default. They identify with Israel rather than their native place where they live. And that's the whole purpose of Zionism, is to bring Jews to Israel. They don't belong. So it's the opposite of emancipatory. But what emancipated Jews was their own efforts. I mean, Jews, for a whole number of reasons, rose, so they became relatively prosperous. I mean, twice the percentage in 1960 of Jews in the upper socioeconomic classes of A and B was twice that of non-Jews. I mean, Jews simply do not suffer from discrimination. No, politically, they would be overrepresented in the House of Commons and in business and so on, the professions. And that's not to say that, you know, they have innate qualities in that respect, but for a whole number of historical reasons, Jews do fairly well in those professions, whereas black people are consigned to the margins. And so we do have to be clear. As regards traumatization about the Holocaust, I actually think Zionism has re-traumatized Jews about the Holocaust because it's deliberately equated the Holocaust with the destruction of Israel, or what they term the destruction of Israel. I mean, like Graham, I mean, I grew up with the Holocaust, in the shadow of the Holocaust. I mean, the first book I read was Lord Russell of Liverpool's Scourge of the Swastika. You may have come across. He was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials, and obviously what happened in Auschwitz appalled me. But even as a child, I drew the conclusion that what happened to Jews was wrong. Therefore, all racism was wrong. But Zionism draws the exact opposite. If Jews suffered, they can make others suffer too. I mean, that's its logic.
Thank you. There were a couple more hands up, I think. Okay, Matthew, and then.
Hi, comrades. I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I think the other thing we've got is the weakness of the left. It's been extraordinary in terms of what's happened in the Labour Party, and I think, you know, in other ways, the weakness of capitalism itself, and the fact that, I mean, the word crisis now is almost sort of a pale shadow of what's actually going on. The system is actually falling apart in front of your eyes, and the ruling class is clinging on and using all these different methods as a means of patching up controls and so on and so forth, including, unfortunately, of course, so in the metropolitan imperialist countries, of course, destroying large sections of the organised working class deliberately, quite deliberately, particularly here in the US, you know, in the move to finance capital. But you know, the weakness of the left in terms of what's been happening in the Labour Party has been extraordinary. You know, the fact that it's basically had nothing to say, it's not been able to organise itself, it's not been able to debate, it's not been able to do anything in a democratic way, you know, the whole lot. And this has been has basically allowed all this stuff to operate. I mean, it's absolutely incredible in those terms. And I think that in one way comes out of, as I say, the dissolution of large sections of the organised working class at the base of the left, but it's also the extreme political weakness, you know, both of you know, I mean, and the dissolution of the organisations of the working class and the political level of the left, that it's allowed these things to take place, you know. And the fact that you've also got a position in which the left itself is in retreat from any kind of Marxist analysis of any sort, you know, away from any notion that the working class itself is there to liberate humanity as a project, and towards various forms of nationalism, identity politics, etc., etc. And I think that is a critical point in this position. Thanks.
The person behind you, sorry.
Thank you very much. Alan Donovan, just to put a name to a face. I'd firstly like to say that I think it's been extremely interesting debate, and I think the first thing we must never forget is the memories from both the speakers, Colin and Tina, as far as their experiences. I think that's the key to it all. As far as weaponisation, I'd like to put my position very clearly here. One of the reasons I'm here is to find out a bit more about it, because I'm under investigation by the Labour Party, mainly for Facebook articles that they've read and examined, primarily putting my point of view that the Labour Party was under control from the British Board of Jews, and that's why Corbyn and various other things had happened. And also I put in a complaint about someone on our own CLP that for a year nothing happened, and I happened to put a comment on Facebook that if it had been anti-Semitism rather than a complaint about another member of the CLP, it would have been dealt with extremely efficiently. So that's the experience of how weaponisation goes. I'd also like to say that I think it's very important that when the Labour Party makes comments, they put it as far as all racism, etc. But I think we need to take into account that at the moment, they're only dealing with one thing. They are very keen to deal with anti-Semitism, but when it comes to Islamophobia, where they take a completely different attitude to the likes of Trevor Phillips, where comments that he'd made, they quickly re-enter him back into the Labour Party without any problem. And when we have a situation of Keir Starmer taking the knee and turning around and asking whether the organisation is a movement or a moment, you need to consider what their position is as far as racism generally. Thanks.
That might have been a slip of the tongue, but I think the Labour Party is under the control of the Jews or even the Zionists. The Board of Deputies. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Faraz.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. Is an elite shadow cabal operating in the UK? Are we allowed to ask, is there an industrial banking military complex? And are they using the human shield of European local anti-Semitism and also provoking the acceptance of global Islamophobia. Islamophobia reflecting an older empire, different empire. Why is the prevent thing happening a soft apartheid? Is the apartheid in Palestine extending all the way to Britain, UK, and possibly to my children? Anti-Black and Asian policing, is it happening? Who is doing this weaponization? That begs the point of the title of this session. And is it racist to ask that? Is there in fact secret meetings taking place to subvert the coming of a classless society in the UK?
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor or contributions? Very briefly, go on.
Just on some of the points Graham made. I mean, I am a white person. I'm a British person, not Jewish. I do not consider I need to be emancipated. That is the usage I was putting it forward. I mean, I do not mean that I am obviously. White people are not subject to the universal human emancipation we expect under communism, but nevertheless we are not oppressed, right? And that's the usage I was using. I have every sympathy with people, with Jewish people who suffered at in the period of when there was still anti-Semitism at large in Western society after the Second World War. I'm not meaning to denigrate that at all, but I'm saying that the situation now is that Jews do not suffer systematic oppression. They probably, I mean, there may be something. There is stuff going on in Eastern Europe which is not nice and is unsavoury, and is a residue of Stalinism and the suppression of certain things that were swept under the carpet for decades by Stalinism. I think that's a different argument, but and that probably needs to be addressed in a separate manner. But my point is about are Jews oppressed today, and I don't think they are in the advanced Western countries. I think that's a legitimate subject to debate and to be addressed. Just on, I'll give it back. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to make a small observation that I think many of the problems we're seeing today is because the Labour Party has not done enough to encourage white working class people and black working class people to recognize that their problems are inherently the same, which is that the 1% of society are using various identity politics tricks, whatever they may be, to separate us from each other and to allow them to consolidate power and consolidate wealth. And we at Resist and the Labour Party, the Labour Conference, all of these need to be talking about that. And the fact that we have Keir Starmer, who is a knight of the realm, somebody who's part of the Trilateral Commission at the head of the Labour Party, is something we should all be concerned about. And that is at the heart of this debate, which is that working class people have the same problems, black or white. Thank you.
Sorry, just one final point to prove weaponisation. There's a big difference here. I may be under investigation, but delegates to the conference were immediately suspended.
Or expelled.
Yeah, or expelled. They were not allowed to attend conference.
Let me just make it clear what the issue is. The issue isn't, Ian, whether Jews in Britain or Western Europe are oppressed as Jews. Because as Tony's got it exactly right, yes, there's prejudice, there's not institutional discrimination. That's not the issue between us. My issue is the words you said, and I suggest you stop using this formulation, that Zionism somehow liberated Jews. It doesn't, it imprisons them in the same way that racism imprisons rather than liberates white people.
Thanks for that's been quite an interesting and passionate discussion. We're just bringing our main speakers back. Any preference who goes first?
She gets some first for us each time.
Yes, she does. I'm an oppressed party here.
Not on a personal level.
Just to make this clear, I get bored of saying this. We don't need to talk about secret cabals or secret rooms. There is a power base going on here. There is a power play going on here. There are people who make decisions without the consent of the people. There are people who have more and people have less. It's called capitalism. And that's all we need to say. Thanks.
Yes, conspiracy theories are usually a pile of cack.
It's interesting, actually. I mean, although the left has been accused of anti-Semitism, historically in the Labour Party, it was the right of the Labour Party that was anti-Semitic, and anti-Semitic in a far more dangerous and lethal way. I'm going to try and write an article about this soon as a result of some of my researches. But during the war, who was Home Secretary? Herbert Morrison, an icon of the Labour right, grandfather of Peter Mandelson, and an ardent Zionist. And he was responsible for the admission or non-admission of Jewish refugees. And he set his face against it. 2,000 Jewish refugees from a Laguerre concentration camp in France under Vichy control. They sought admission before the Nazis overran Vichy France. Herbert Morrison refused. They were deported to Auschwitz. Labour anti-Semitism, Herbert Morrison in particular, was responsible for the death of thousands of Jews. That's what anti-Semitism really meant. And, you know, his excuse was that, well, it would cause anti-Semitism in Britain. In fact, 80%, because this followed the declaration by the Allies on the 17th of December, 1942, that there was a Holocaust. And 80% of public opinion was in favour of admission. And yet Herbert Morrison refused. But in a later aside, he explained why. He thought there would be an explosive element after the war. In other words, what he thought was that these Jews who came in would be part of the kind of militant strikers and so on, and he didn't want them in. And if that wasn't anti-Semitism, I don't know what was. But so, I mean, and Morrison wasn't the only one. I've got a whole series of quotes from different figures, including Ramsay MacDonald, about what genuine anti-Semitism. But we need to be clear. I mean, Jews have changed. I mean, if you thought about a Jew in 1945, you thought about a militant trade unionist who went on strike at the least any opportunity. I mean, Jews were prominent at all levels of the trade union movement. Phil Piratin was the only communist MP elected as under the communist label in Britain. Half of the electors in Mile End who voted for him were Jewish. Hackney North in 1979, Geoffrey Alderman couldn't find a single Jew who'd voted for the Communist Party then, but he found 2% of them had voted for the National Front, a Holocaust denial organisation. So, I mean, there's a substantial, massive change in who is Jewish today. Why anti-Semitism? Of course, it's not about anti-Semitism at all. But you know, when Britain went to India, we didn't go to exploit it, you understand. We went because Hindu women, widows, were being burnt on the pyres of their husbands' city. That's why we went to India, to civilize it. You know, I mean, just as we went to Afghanistan to liberate the women. We didn't go to it because we had any other ulterior designs, and perish the thought that we had anything else up our sleeve. So imperialism, every ruling class, every ruling class has its own moral justification because it couldn't exist if it didn't have that. Even the Nazis had their own moral justification. And that's what anti-Semitism is about today. It's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's got to do with the identification with something good about a persecuted people, totally divorced from reality. And if we understand that, we understand everything. But the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party has actually had the effect of increasing anti-Semitism, ironically. I mean, 2 years ago, Chris Williamson spoke in Brighton. The Zionists stopped him speaking at 3 different venues, and he spoke in the end at Regency Square. It was a great victory for the left and freedom of speech. But I was in the supermarket a couple of days later when 2 people had been there, were talking amongst themselves, and one of them said to the other, the Jews are trying to stop Chris Williamson, or tried to stop Chris Williamson speaking. And I intervened and said, no, not the Jews, the Zionists. But it's understandable why they thought that, because it's the Board of Deputies says it represents all Jews. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, comrades. That was a lively debate. I'd urge you to stay here for the rest of the day. There's some more interesting sessions coming up.